So yeah, for the final video, wanted to take a look at something a bit more organic. So looking at this stylized grass texture, we're going to be looking at how to add some directionality and flow to the grass blades, as well as how to have areas where it's appearing very dense, but then in other areas it's allowed to breathe a little more. Before going on to some minor simple vegetation, using the shape splatter node and seeing how that can help us achieve more control over the use of our colors. These grass blades are quite simple. It's really just two different shapes. So there's this main one here, and then there's these smaller tufts of grass like this. So nothing too complex, it works quite well, and that's just creating a shape and then a trapezoid, clamping it to a simple shape. I use this blend node just with the left and right cropping areas just to get rid of this over here and on the right side, and then add a gradient to it with a histogram scan so that we can control the length of the fall off, and then a non-uniform blur just to smooth it out at the end, and that kind of gives it a bit of chunkiness to it, which works really well here. And I'm just running this through into the tile sampler. It's a pretty simple standard setup. The only special thing going on here really is that there's a Gaussian noise that I'm running into a rotation map. So let's take a look at that without the rotation map. Yeah, so it's all just going in completely one direction. This rotation random is forcing it to rotate based on the values of this Gaussian noise. And that just helps make it feel more natural and like it's flowing in a more natural manner. Now I've also got this tuft that's just the original grass blade, and then I've just used a splatter circular and just made it a bit larger with this transform 2D, and then I just run that through another tile sampler. This one's less frequent than the previous one. And then we just use a height blend to kind of combine them together. So this is it without, and then we can bring it in, and it kind of blends quite nicely together. Previously, when creating color variation maps, it's been pretty simple because we've got very specific patterns like concrete tiles and planks. In this case, where we have gradients that were needed for the height map, we have to do a bit of a hack. So to do that, you can copy the existing tile samplers from the height map and just plug in the same inputs, but they're going to be clamped into solid shapes. And all we're changing really is just the color random. So that's set by default to 0, but we're going to put it to 1 to create a luminosity mask. And then in the height map, play around with that, see what best fits your original height map. And we're going to just throw in some complementary or interesting colors that we think will work well with grass. And just do a blur HQ because before it gets a bit noisy. And this, doesn't look like a great map. It's a random mess right now. But when overlaid at a very low level, it does adds a lot of variation. So this is before, and this is it with, we put it at about 0.2, and that just gives it a bit more character and just a lot more areas of interest. However, there is a danger to this, and that is if later we change the settings in any of these, then these ones are going to be out of date and not line up with the original grass. So there's either two options here, and neither of them are perfect, but either create the color variation at the end when you know these are perfect for you, or you can expose these before creating these and expose all your anything that you've changed, like scale, position, rotation, etc. And with those exposed parameters, then that's when you copy it over so that they share the same exposed parameters. And then afterwards, if you want to change any of this, then do it through your exposed parameters, and then they'll all update in real time. Next, we're going to take a look at vegetation, in particular these clover leaves and flowers. I'm going to zoom in a little, and you can see that there's a lot of ugly intersections if you really zoom in. Now, you could spend hours and hours trying to make each element show perfectly and not intersect, but that time could be better spent on creating new vegetation or even a new texture. So it really depends on your situation. But in this case, if it's just for practice, then I would say don't get too stressed about avoiding little issues like that. Notice also that there's rounded edges to these leaves, but also the grass blades and the flowers even. This is really just a non-uniform blur, and I'll show you in a second how that's applied within each individual different shape. So first, the clover is really just it starts out as a circle and then a trapezoid, and we're just creating this heart shape, and this is where we add that blend, the non-uniform blur, to round out the edges a bit. And then I'm using gradients to bend it around the edges and have it dip towards the end, just giving it more shape. And then we add a very simple stem, again more non-uniform blur, and just blurring the edges a bit more. This can all be refined and controlled. And then I use a splatter circular to create a 3-leaf version and a 4-leaf. Feel free to do as many as you wish. And finally, this gradient that goes over the whole thing. So as we rotate this in the tile sampler, they'll be at different rotations, not just per leaf, but also per cluster. We then use a shape splatter node. It's similar to the tile sampler, but there's a lot more complexities to it. It's really just a case of plugging in your previous height map into the background and then adding in the patterns. So with vegetation, I kind of want it to appear as much as possible between the grass. So to do that, I took the height map, and we can get a mask of the areas between the grass by clamping the height map in such a way and plugging that into the mask random. And that's essentially the same as the mask map input in our tile sampler. So there's our shape splatter. And the reason we do this is because it creates these splatter data 1 and splatter data 2. And if we plug that into a shape splatter data extract and the pattern ID, then we get a mask of this. And this mask can be used in the roughness map, which is super useful. But it's also used in the albedo. And I just want to start this from scratch, so to speak. Just trying to find it now. So it's this, so your two splatter datas, and then you run your previous albedo into the background, and then finally you can just run a color into here. And as you can see, by the way, if sometimes I find that the input is always black. If it is, just change the color input opacity. At first, all the green values are exactly the same, but what we can do is actually use this HSL random. And this, by just changing something like the luminous, notice now that all the greens are going slightly different values, and we can do the same with saturation and even color. And this is just a really easy, quick way of getting a really nice variety of colors within our splattered shapes. So after that, we do similar with the flower petals. This one is a little bit more complex because we want to be able to control the individual elements of these flowers being different colors and being able to choose which colors they can be. And to do that, it's just creating a tile generator with a square times by 4 with different luminance, putting that through our auto levels and just running that through a gradient map. So similar to what we do before with the auto levels. And then running that through a warp with a Perlin noise to create a really wacky map like this. So when that's going into the color input, it's essentially saying, well, there's 4 colors here. There's white, blue, this pinkish color, and this purple. And it will just assign an individual color to each element. And again, we've got this HSL random that we can change the luminance for and the saturation random to get even more variation of those selected tones. And then finally, I created a flower bud, and I had to use exactly the same, so I just duplicated this one because it needed to have the same values of the flower petals, and that just overlays on top. And again, kind of similar to the clover leaf, it uses yellow, but I have some variants on the HSL random. So yeah, these shape splatter blend nodes can be really useful when you really need control over your colors. So finally, let's take a look at the edge highlights. In this case, pretty simple. We take the final height map and run that through the height to normal world units where we've got various controls and curvature smooth. And then finally, histogram select. Notice here that there's these nice intensified parts at the ends of the blades. This works really well, even with just a white uniform color and set to overlay. We get these nice yellow tinges towards the end of the tips. So at the end, sometimes, I'll just go over the normal intensity just to make sure that we're getting the right look that we want. Same with the AO. It's just sometimes you can really dramatically improve your texture pretty quickly. So it's always worth just checking those at the end. And if your material is heavily dependent on edge highlights, then it's worth just going through the height to normal world units node, playing around with these, and the same with the histogram select. That just about wraps up this video and the series. This material in particular is actually a good one to finish with because it holds true to many of the fundamentals that we explored earlier in the series. So, keeping areas of color that are just completely flat, that's okay. Try to avoid noise everywhere. Break up your noise. carefully pick your colors. So when you're using gradient maps, just keep as minimal as possible. Try to not have over 10, for example. The less you have, the easier it is to control your colors. And finally, when it comes to detail, just remember that larger and fewer phrase. So in this case, that was certainly used with these flowers and the clothes. We could have had many, many more flowers and make them smaller, but then it would have gone towards photoreal. Keeping them larger and fewer just helps push it towards that stylized look that we're going for. Hope this series has helped in some way, and thanks for watching. In the meantime, you can keep up to date with my content over at caponeart.studio.